cloud. Because I'll forget once I start getting excited about all these people. And we have about 4 times as many who've expressed interest but couldn't be here tonight. So, and we put these up on a YouTube channel for future generations to learn from.
Well, I'll be very sort of careful with what I say.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and welcome everybody, and I'm sure we'll have more people joining. My name's Maya Deary. I'm with the Cape Fear chapter of the Surfrider Foundation, and these talks are part of our hopefully broader initiative to reinterpret Surfrider's historic mission of ensuring access, enjoyment, and protection to oceans, waves, and beaches. We started our justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work a couple of years ago here locally, and very rapidly realized that if we wanted to diversify the surfing lineup and the beach, that we were going to have to start with swim lessons someplace maybe a little bit safer than in the waves. And so that led us to beautiful collaborations and lots of partnerships with people here in Wilmington, North Carolina, that I can detail in another context. But it also led us to Dr. Jeff Wilste's work, studying the history of swimming pools in the US and writing a book about the history of swimming pools, specifically in the northern US, as opposed to what was happening in the Southeast here. Dr. Wilste is a professor of history at the University of Montana, and his book is called Contested Waters, A Social History of Swimming Pools in America. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's maybe the most succinct way that I can think of to answer the questions that people tend to have about why does it really matter to start with aquatics when there's so much social justice work that needs to be done. There are so many inequities. Why would you prioritize aquatic recreation when it's just play? And this story does a great job of answering that question. So Dr. Wilste is going to talk to us for maybe 45 minutes and maybe a little back and forth if he wants to. And then please put questions in the chat. And when we get to Q&A time, if you have had to peel off or something, I'll ask your question, but you can also just raise your little Zoom hand and we'll ask you to unmute. Okay, Dr. Wilste, thank you so much for being with us. Please tell us about this work.
Well, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you inviting me to talk to you all. So I want to start with a contrast and then fill in the history in between. Some of you may be familiar with the work of a historian named Kevin Dawson, who published a book called Undercurrents of Power. And it's a story that looks at swimming cultures among the African diaspora in the New World. And one of the conclusions that Kevin comes to is that at the end of the 19th century, people of African ancestry were more likely to be swimmers and were more likely to be better swimmers in the Americas than people of European ancestry. Or put differently, put more simply, at the end of the 19th century, people of African ancestry were better swimmers in the Americas than were people of European ancestry. Well, today it's different. Studies, and the biggest study was one that was done by the University of Memphis, and it's now been, 12 or so years ago, in which there was a major study done by scholars at the University of Memphis that found that Black Americans are about half as likely to know how to swim as white Americans. And then drowning statistics that are put out by the CDC show that depending upon the age, Black children are about 4 to 6 times more likely to drown than are white children. And so it's today, in my mind, both an issue of social justice and also issue of public health. And for me, the key is, how did things change so dramatically? How did we get from the late 19th century, when people of African ancestry were more likely to be swimmers and better swimmers, to today, just the opposite? And kind of without intending, my book and some articles that I've written after the book has come out, I think provide the answer to that. When I started this project, I was certainly not aware of what the history in the late 19th century was, or what the statistics were showing or studies were showing today. I just set out to write a history of swimming pools, because it literally came to me in a dream as sort of a topic to do my PhD dissertation on. Unfortunately, sort of at the latter stages of getting the book published, I began to recognize that there were sort of important implications to the history that I had researched and was telling in the book. And so what I want to do is take some time to go through and give you at least the broad outlines of how that change occurs from the late 19th century to the present. And I don't have prepared remarks, but I've talked about this enough that I should be able to relatively coherently take my way, or would take you all through this. So the first point that I want to make is Maya indicated, that my research focuses mainly on the northern United States, although I did do some research on the South, and can certainly talk some about that. But mainly what I'll focus on is what I found for the northern United States, although there's certainly national implications for it. So public swimming pools were first built in the United States during the late 19th century, and they were built in large northern industrial cities. And so Philadelphia had some of the very earliest pools. Boston had early pools. New York had some early pools, but not maybe as early as you might think. Chicago had some early pools. And so those were the cities in which the first public pools were built. St. Louis. And one of the surprising things that I found in my research was that at those earliest pools, they were not racially segregated, that blacks and whites swam together, and all the evidence that I was able to find indicated that they did so really without conflict or tension, or certainly not any more conflict or tension that accompanied the mixed sort of ethnic use of pools. So, Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, and that race in the use of these early pools was not any more significant or meaningful of a division or distinction than, say, was ethnicity. Now, what's important to understand is that these early pools, they were gender segregated, that males and females did not swim together. The pools were intended to function as baths, that they were located in poor urban neighborhoods that were at the time called slums, immigrant neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods that did not have bathing facilities in their homes. And so city officials wanted to combat the spread of diseases, and they believed the way to do that was to encourage sort of cleanliness among the urban poor, and so that these pools were intended to provide a bathing place for the urban poor. And so males and females didn't use them together, blacks and whites did, rich and poor did not. These were public spaces that were used exclusively by the poor and the working classes. And so that's the beginning of this history. That basically persists through the early 20th century. And so there are some redefinitions of the intended function of pools. So once the germ theory of disease transmission becomes popularly accepted in the 1890s, all of a sudden using pools as baths is no longer a good idea. That studies begin to show that, in fact, a bath in which people plunge themselves into and clean themselves actually becomes an excellent vehicle for transmitting microbes rather than a way to combat the spread of diseases. And then eventually in the early 20th century, there's chlorine and chemical treatments that then take care of that. But at this point, pools are no longer really useful as baths, and so they get redefined as recreation institutions. And they're still primarily targeted for the poor and the working classes in large cities, but now they're particularly targeted to children. That public pools are supposed to provide kind of an oasis of recreation amidst the heat and the lack of other recreation opportunities in cities. Chicago and progressive reformers in Chicago led the way in this redefinition of pools. But still, even in the early 20th century, the pools, at least in northern cities, are still racially integrated, but gender segregated. The key moment of change, in my mind, in the history of public swimming pools comes during the 1920s and 1930s. It was during that period that public officials fundamentally redesigned public swimming pools and then fundamentally changed the social environment at pools. And so beginning in the 1920s, public officials began to build and fund very, very large public pools. So the earlier pools, whether they be the bathhouse pools or the playground pools of the early 20th century, were relatively small, on a scale of maybe, 40 feet long, 40 feet wide and 60 feet long, kind of what you would typically think of as a relatively small rectangular pool. The pools that were built during the interwar years, the 1920s and 1930s, were enormous. I characterize them as being leisure resorts. They were larger than football fields. Some pools, like Fairgrounds Park Pool in St. Louis, it was a circular pool that was 400 feet in diameter and could accommodate literally thousands of swimmers at a time. The largest pool that I've been able to find, and it was regarded at the time as the largest public pool in the country, was Fleischacker Pool, which was in San Francisco, and it was 1,000 feet long and 120 feet wide. And in doing my research, I found this fantastic photograph of the pool in which there were lifeguards in a rowboat out in the middle of the pool. It was so large that lifeguards would go out in the middle of it in a rowboat. And these pools were surrounded by leisure space. Some of the pools, like Fairgrounds Park Pool in St. Louis, had an artificial sandy beach. Some were surrounded by grassy lawns, others by broad concrete decks that allowed patrons to lay out and begin sunbathing. Just as kind of a cultural landmark, or cultural milestone, it's in the 1920s that sunbathing becomes a popular kind of cultural fad among white people within the United States. And these leisure resort pools becomes one of the main spaces at which that occurs, along obviously with beaches on the seashore. But if you're living in Pittsburgh, PA, you don't have much access to the seashore. Same with people in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, that's the redesign of swimming pools that occurs. And because public officials want these pools to serve as really vibrant public spaces, as community gathering spaces, they also, very much intend them to function as a space for families to come together to recreate. I don't know how much you know about the public recreation habits of Americans during the late 19th and early 20th century, but they tended to be homosocial, meaning that public recreation tended to split along sex lines, that males would congregate and recreate at places like saloons, and women would congregate and recreate separately. And there was a concerted effort by public officials to begin to break down that sex-segregated character of public recreation. And they saw swimming pools as being an appealing public space that could do that. And so it's a long way of me saying that these leisure resort pools were gender integrated, that this was the first time that public officials allowed males and females to use public pools at the same time. And there's a whole fascinating kind of cultural consequence to that I won't go into great detail because it's a little bit off topic that what I want to focus on. But what ends up happening is that swimming pools become sexualized public spaces of exhibitionism and voyeurism, and swimmers, both male and female, begin pushing the boundaries of what was considered to be acceptable swimsuits. That at the beginning of this period, swimsuits covered almost the entirety of a woman's body and much of a men's body, that men wore like basically shirts that covered their upper torso and shorts that went down to about mid-thigh. Well, as the 1920s and into the 1930s progress, the acceptable size of swimsuit shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. So women start wearing tight-fitting one-piece swimsuits. Men shed their uppers and are just wearing now tight-fitting shorts. And so males and females are now exposing much, much more of their bodies. And that in part accounts for the popularity of swimming pools. Fortune magazine, of all sort of periodicals, wrote an article in the early 1930s about why swimming pools are so popular, that they just surge in popularity during this period. And the great line from this Fortune article is that swimming pools became so popular because they unleashed the full voltage of cosmic urge, which was their way of sort of making the point that these had become sexualized spaces. Now, and again, this is I'll talk a bit about the South, but when it comes to racial segregation, the story is a little bit different. That I did not find any swimming pools in the South ever, anywhere at least south of St. Louis during this period where blacks and whites were swimming together in the same pools. I did find evidence in St. Louis, and also in Baltimore. But I mean, St. Louis was a particularly interesting case because St. Louis, even though it's in a border state, very much has kind of a Southern history and Southern culture to it. And so I was really surprised to find at some of the very earliest pools that were gender segregated that there's evidence of blacks and whites swimming together in these pools. But getting now to the point of the 1920s and 1930s, when city officials permitted males and females to begin using the same pools together, that's when they implemented racial segregation. And actually, I need to be more careful in how I put it. That's when swimming pools in the North became racially segregated. In some cases, and this was the case in Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in Newton, Kansas, and so in cities that are in border states or the southern tier of northern states, the racial segregation was official city policy. And so it was a de jure form of segregation when cities would say, at these gender integrated pools, blacks and whites cannot swim together. And what that meant is that identifiably black people were denied access to these pools, that there were police at the pools, there were attendants at the pool. Anyone who was identifiably black was not permitted to enter into the pools that were earmarked for whites. I want to return to what pools were open to black residents of these cities in a minute. But before I get to that, I want to talk about what happened in more northern cities. So even in more northern cities, in places like Chicago and Pittsburgh and New York, the pools, even though they were not officially racially segregated, nonetheless, the use of them clearly divided along racial lines. And this is again during the 1920s and 1930s. And there were a variety of ways that this de facto form of racial segregation occurred, but the primary one was the use of violence and the threat of violence as a means of intimidation. And there's several swimming pools that I write about at which there was violence used to intimidate black swimmers from accessing pools that were earmarked for whites. The pool that I give the most attention to and provides, in my mind, the best example is Highland Park Pool in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so Highland Park Pool, it was opened relatively late. It wasn't opened until 1931. And it was the first of Pittsburgh's large resort-like pools. And previously, at other pools in Pittsburgh, blacks and whites swam together because those pools remained gender segregated. Highland Park Pool is the first pool in Pittsburgh that was gender integrated and was a large resort pool. On the first day that the pool opened in 1931, several African Americans came expecting to be admitted to this pool, just as they were admitted to other pools in the city. But each and every identifiably Black person who tried to enter Highland Park Pool that first day was sort of pulled out of the line, and they were required to show a health certificate testifying that they were disease-free. Well, they didn't have these health certificates, and so they were not permitted to enter into the pool. And one of the main points that I'm going to make here in just a minute is that the primary cause of racial segregation and racial exclusion from swimming pools in the North was the gender integration and the racist fears that were commonplace at the time among whites that Black men posed a sexual threat to white women, and that this would be particularly acute in a sexualized space like swimming pools. But as that health certificate requirement for identifiably Black people also indicates, there were also concerns among whites at this time that African Americans were likely to be physically dirty and were more likely to carry communicable diseases than white people. And so that was sort of a racist prejudice that was applied to Black Americans at this time as well, that also played a role in the racial segregation of pools. But, and to my mind, this is sort of what recommends very clearly the argument that gender integration was the primary concern is, why weren't these fears, these sort of racist prejudices of Black Americans being dirtier and more likely to be carrying communicable diseases, likewise being applied to the gender segregated pools in Pittsburgh, where Blacks and whites still swam together. So I don't want to drag this story on too long, but let me give you a few more minutes with it. So that evening, leaders of the local chapter of the NAACP in Pittsburgh meet with city officials and complain about Black swimmers being treated differently than white swimmers by having to show this health certificate. And so the city officials promised that no further overt forms of discrimination like that will take place in accessing Highland Park Pool. And so in the next several days, sure enough, groups of Black swimmers returned to Highland Park Pool. And it's important, I think, to understand who these Black swimmers were. They were primarily teenage boys. 14, 15, 16-year-old boys. I mean, we're not talking about, 30-year-old men. These are teenage boys, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys. They return to Highland Park Pool. They're admitted into the pool. As soon as they enter into the water, they're surrounded by about 200 white men who begin attacking them in the water. They pull the boys underneath the water to simulate drowning. They punch them and they kick them until, through this violence, they drive the teenage boys out of the pool. And then this is one of the kickers. Well, let me get to the next story. So over the next couple of weeks, groups of young Black men continue to return to Highland Park Pool. But this time, gangs of whites meet them outside the pool, and they throw rocks at them. They beat them with clubs, and they beat with them with sticks as a way to prevent and intimidate them from entering Highland Park Pool. There were police officers stationed at Highland Park Pool, and they did arrest people. But the people they arrested were the Black victims of the violence, and I kid you not, they charged them with inciting to riot. And what that shows is that even though public officials said no further discrimination would occur, that the police, with the approval of public officials, worked in combination with the white thugs in intimidating Black swimmers from entering the pool. And so it's a long way of making the point that violence and the threat of violence was a primary way in which white swimmers imposed a de facto form of racial segregation at swimming pools in the North. Another major way of imposing de facto racial segregation was through where the pools were located. That city officials were very, very careful in choosing where they would locate pools, and pools that they wanted to be used by whites were located in thoroughly white neighborhoods where it would be intimidating for any prospective Black swimmer to go. Now, in some cases, Black swimmers were provided what were known as Jim Crow pools in which to swim. And so this occurred only in large cities that could afford to build many pools. And so in a city like New York, there were a couple of pools that were intended for Black swimmers built during the 1930s. Similarly, in Philadelphia, in Chicago. So in large cities, there was one or two pools that was earmarked for Black swimmers. Now, almost always, these pools were much inferior to the pools that were built for white swimmers. Very, very few of these were the leisure resort type pools that were being built during this time for white swimmers that attracted literally thousands and thousands of swimmers at a time and turned into these vibrant public spaces where also, and this is, I think, particularly germane to the story, is where swimming lessons occurred. Prior to the 1920s, swimming was not a common skill that most Americans, it was not a common skill among Americans. In fact, relatively few Americans knew how to swim prior to the 1920s. And what enabled a massive surge in swimming proficiency and the popularity of swimming during the 1920s and 1930s were these large leisure resort pools that were so appealing and accessible, and the swimming lessons that occurred at them. That cities throughout the country initiated learn to swim campaigns as a part of opening these pools, and that they taught in different cities thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people to swim. And this significantly sort of proliferated both the popularity of swimming and swim knowledge. The problem was that Black Americans had so much less access to swimming pools and to the swim lessons than did whites. And a particularly good example of this is St. Louis. St. Louis had a relatively large African-American population. And in the 1920s and early 1930s, the city of St. Louis opened 7 new public pools. 2 of those pools, Fairgrounds Pool and Marquette Pool. Fairgrounds Pool is a little bit earlier than that, but during the 1920s and 1930s, there were 7 pools operating, public pools operating in St. Louis. 2 of them were large leisure resort pools. All 7 of those pools were for whites only. Even though there was a significant African-American population in St. Louis, they had access to no public pools. Finally, in 1936, St. Louis finally opened a pool for Black residents, but it was a very, very small pool that could not accommodate many swimmers and did not offer extensive swim lessons. And so what you see here is this clear disparity that for most of this period, when swimming was become popularized, Black residents of St. Louis had access to no public pools, whereas white residents had access to these very appealing leisure resort pools. And when Black residents finally do get a pool, it's not nearly as large, accommodating, or appealing as for white swimmers. And as a result of this, sort of a generation of white Americans learns to swim Some Black Americans during this period learned to swim, but relatively few because of the discrimination. One other key point to make is that in small cities and towns that could only afford one pool, racial segregation meant racial exclusion. That one pool was for white residents, and Black residents had access to no pools. And so denied access to pools, denied access to swim lessons at pools. And so here's where you clearly begin to see the shift from people of African ancestry being more common swimmers and better swimmers to people of European ancestry being more common swimmers and better swimmers. And it's a direct result of a very, very discriminatory access. In doing my research on this period, 1930s, 1940s, as I mentioned to Maya just before we started, this was before newspapers were digitized and keyword searchable. And so I would literally go through, I would go to a town like Newton, Kansas, and I would go into the basement of their library. I would get out microfilm reels of their own old newspapers. And the only thing I really had going for me was that I really could focus on the summer months. I could avoid the winter months, and I could just focus on the summer months. And I would literally go page by page by page through these microfilm reels. And I was always happy if it was a weekly newspaper rather than a daily newspaper, because the daily newspapers was a lot of pages. But what the benefit of that is that I came across a lot of articles that weren't just about swimming pools. And I came across a lot of articles of drownings. And one of the things that stood out to me was the disproportionate number of African-American children who drowned in the natural waters around their town and the city, and these were reported upon in the newspaper. I mean, one of the common things in newspapers from the 1920s and 30s and 40s was if it was an African-American, they would identify them as being Negro. And so the newspaper would say, 9-year-old Negro child drowns in river. And the conclusion that I drew from this, and I haven't studied this carefully enough to really draw conclusive conclusions, definitive conclusions, but it certainly seemed to me that African-American children wanted the pleasure of water-based recreation, but because they didn't have access to the relative safety of a supervised swimming pool, instead, they would swim in the much less safe waters of rivers and lakes and ponds. And because they didn't have good swimming proficiency from swim lessons, they were very, very vulnerable to drowning. And so a disproportionate number of Black children during this period drowned from being sort of, what's the right word? From being denied access to supervised pools and having to swim in unsupervised water. And this is where I don't have the evidence to really make a definitive claim on this, but it seems to me that this is part of the explanation for why even today there is a more general fear of water within African-American families and within African-American communities than within white families and white communities. That one of the benefits of my book getting quite a bit of attention, I've been asked to give a lot of talks, is I've had an opportunity to receive feedback from many African-Americans who have heard me talk about this history. And they point to that, within their family, aunts or uncles or grandparents, it was commonplace for them to be afraid of the water. And I think that there's a very, very historically good reason for that. And it's precisely because of the disproportionate number of Black children who drowned in natural water during the middle decades of the 20th century. Now, one sort of story that's a little bit more optimistic during this period of time. Maya said, can we offer up some sort of optimism and some hope? So here's a good story of optimism and hope. Washington, D.C. In 1925, Congress, so the federal government was responsible for funding recreation within the District of Columbia. And so in 1925, Congress passed a funding bill that would fund public swimming pools for the residents of the District of Columbia. And written into this federal law was the mandate that the pools that were built be racially segregated. I mean, it literally says one for the white race and one for the black race. Well, it turned out to be two for the white race and two for the black race. That over the next several years in the late 1920s, early 1930s, Washington, D.C. built 4 public swimming pools, 2 for white residents and 2 for black residents. And while we can look back and regret and lament the racial segregation, what was unique about the pools built for black residents of the District of Columbia is that they were the large leisure resort type that were every bit as nice as the facilities provided for whites. And so in this one case of Washington, D.C., it was in fact separate but equal. Almost nowhere else was it equal and separate. But in the case of Washington, D.C., it was. And so the benefit of that is it provided me with a case study of when an African-American community is provided appealing and accessible swimming pools where swim lessons are given and they organize swim teams, what happens? And well, guess what happened? Swimming flourished among the African-American community in Washington, D.C. And the best example of that is it was not only the 2 pools, and the 2 pools were called Francis Pool and Banneker Pool. It was not just that those 2 pools organized swim teams. It was that, the schools were segregated in Washington, D.C. as well. But the African-American schools in Washington, D.C., including sort of more than a dozen elementary schools, several middle schools, a couple of high schools, they all formed swim teams as well. Like all of these African-American schools had swim teams, and they competed against one another during the summer at Francis and Banneker Pool. Furthermore, these pools attracted large numbers of swimmers, not just children, but adults, and they became really, really vibrant public spaces. And so what that shows is that at this historical moment, when Black Americans were falling behind significantly in swimming proficiency and the popularity of swimming, it's clearly because they didn't have access to appealing and accessible pools, because in the case where they did, swimming absolutely flourished. And so that's sort of the inspiring, that's my inspiring story. I may have more inspiring stories later. That was this, so 1920s and 1930s was the era of segregation when it came to pools. The post-war period, the post-World War II period, so beginning in the late 1940s and continuing into the mid-1960s was the desegregation period in the history of public swimming pools. So immediately following World War II, for reasons that have a lot to do with the democratic rhetoric of the war, that the United States is fighting against fascism, fighting for freedom and equality and liberty. The Pittsburgh Courier, an African-American newspaper, initiated during the war its double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad, victory against racial discrimination at home. And so immediately following the war, in the North, there was a civil rights movement led in many cases by local chapters of the NAACP, but it was also very much a biracial movement. There were many white Americans, white Northerners who contributed to the struggle against racial desegregation in the North, specifically at swimming pools. And so in the late 1940s, early 1950s, swimming pools in the North begin to be racially desegregated. In some cases, it's decisions made by local public officials. And local public officials recognize that in sort of the new post-World War II sort of ideology of democracy and liberty and equality, sort of overt forms of racial discrimination and racial violence at pools is no longer tenable. And so they opened up pools to whites and blacks without discrimination. In other cases, it was federal courts that local chapters of the NAACP would file suit against their city. The cases would go to federal judges. And during the post-war period, federal judges over and over and over again ruled in favor of Black swimmers and issued injunctions ordering cities to end racial segregation at public pools. So this all sounds good. And so the assumption then when I tell this to people is that, well, all right, lots and lots of new pools opened up to Black swimmers. The discrimination of the past came to an end, and a generation of Black swimmers learns to swim because of this desegregation. That happens in a very limited way. And so, yes, Black swimmers got access to some additional pools, but the promise of desegregation was significantly limited by a variety of responses among white public officials and white swimmers to desegregation. And so the easiest, and I mean, the simplest story is what happened in the South. In the South, cities simply closed down their public pools. That when federal courts ordered Southern cities to end de jure segregation, public officials said, we're not willing to allow Blacks and whites to swim together, and so we're going to close down our public pools to all swimmers, which meant that in many, many areas of the South, in many communities within the South during this period, if you wanted to swim, you had to belong to or pay for access to a private pool. And another important point to make is that at least at this point, it was still constitutional for private clubs to racially discriminate against people who wanted to access those clubs. It was not until 1973 that the US Supreme Court, in a case involving a suburban Washington, D.C. swimming club, ruled that private swim clubs cannot use race as a basis for denying membership to someone who wanted to become a member. But up until 1973, even after public pools were being racially desegregated by court orders, courts determined that at private clubs, racial discrimination was still constitutional. And so in the South, Black Americans in the South at this point in time did not get access to many pools due to desegregation, because in most cases, cities closed them down. White swimmers retreated to private pools that could still legally discriminate against African Americans. Now, in the North, the reaction to desegregation is a little bit more complex and complicated. In most cases that I was able to find, white swimmers abandoned pools that became accessible to Black swimmers. And so public pools that had been earmarked or had been for whites only, but were located near African-American neighborhoods, Black swimmers began using those pools. And when white swimmers realized that Black swimmers were going to use those pools, they vacated them in very, very large numbers. Again, cities would keep statistics, usage statistics, and at least during this time, they would identify the users based upon race. And so I could literally tell that the usage of pools, say in Baltimore, that had previously been whites only pools, white usage of those pools declined by 97% based upon the attendance statistics that were kept by the city of Baltimore. And what white swimmers did is they either retreated to public pools that were located in thoroughly white neighborhoods, where it was still intimidating for Black swimmers to go into these white neighborhoods to swim in this pool. And so the surrounding neighborhood, the surrounding white neighborhood, offered as a buffer, sort of an intimidation to Black swimmers that, yeah, I'm not going to enter that white neighborhood that's hostile and try to swim in this pool. The other thing that white swimmers did was, as a part of what was known as white flight, moving out of cities into the suburbs, they chose in suburbs almost always to fund private club pools. And so during the post-war period, the 1950s and 1960s, there is the enormous growth of suburbs on the outskirts of cities throughout the country. And the residents of those suburbs, they want to swim. And so they want swimming pools. And they could have done what previous generations had done in cities, which was to use public money to fund pools, but they almost always chose not to do that. And the reason, quite clearly in the historical record, is because funding private club pools enabled them to exercise much greater control over who could become members and thus who they would be swimming with. And while poor and working class whites, I mean, they weren't living in the cities too much, in the suburbs too much anyway, but it became a way to exclude other social classes. The primary purpose of being a private club was to exclude people of color, African Americans in particular. And so among the literally tens of thousands, there were tens of thousands of private club pools that were developed in suburbs in the late 1950s and the 1960s. Almost none of them, and I mean literally almost none of them, allowed Black members. And the pools that did allow Black members were pretty much all Black. That there were a couple of private swim clubs that were developed within suburban Black neighborhoods. One was on the outskirts of Philadelphia, and it's still operating. And the name off the top, the name will come to me, but it escapes me right now. I actually, a couple summers ago, went and visited them. And it was, for me, it was great. They actually knew about my book and about my research. And so I was sort of a minor celebrity at the pool. And it was founded, I think, 1956 by middle-class Black families on the outskirts of Philadelphia who were denied membership at the local private club that was founded by white families. And it's still going today. And right now it's actually thriving. They're developing new facilities. Membership is going up. They've got a swim team that's associated with it. Any which way, it's just a thriving sort of suburban club pool. And it was nice to see that there were white families that were members as well. Most of the members today are African-American families, but there were white families that were there swimming who are members as well. And so now it's very much a biracial institution or a multiracial institution. Now, the private club pools, these tens of thousands of private club pools that were developed in suburbs and were almost all lily white, they became, during the 1950s and 1960s, the institutions at which there was another major surge in the popularity of swimming and another major surge in accessing swim lessons. And so I know that I've been talking on and on and on, and let me kind of wrap up with this point, and then I'm sure I'll talk about more things if you have questions. But I mean, basically my argument is that the reason why we continue today to have a significant race-based swimming disparity is not primarily because of overt racial discrimination today. And I'm not saying there does not continue to be racial discrimination today. I mean, every once in a while, an incident will arise, like at the Valley Club outside of Philadelphia about 10 years ago, or a few instances in the summer of 2018 in which at various different swimming pools, and these were kind of in the South and in border states, where a Black family would show up at a pool, and all of a sudden, one or more of the whites who was at the pool began questioning, what are you doing here? And it was sort of like, you really don't belong here. You're out of place here. And so there very, very much continues to be sort of racial prejudices regarding African Americans in pools, and that pools are not a place, especially pools at which whites are swimming at, that there's an uncomfort level with African Americans swimming at those pools. I mean, and that absolutely still exists today. But I think to a large degree, what explains the persistent race-based swimming disparities, and to a certain extent the race-based drowning disparities, is this past discrimination. That there were two periods in the 20th century in which swimming became broadly popularized among white Americans. The first was in the 1920s and 1930s at the over 1,000 public pools that were built during that period in time. And then the second period was during the 1950s and 1960s at the tens of thousands of private club pools that were built in suburbs that middle-class whites had access to. And that discrimination, and that African Americans had very limited access to. And so at the same time in which swimming was becoming popularized among white Americans because they had access to these swimming facilities, Black Americans were much more restricted in their access, and so swimming did not become nearly as popular. And my argument is that we can understand this in terms of sort of recreational culture, that swimming became a common part of white Americans' recreational culture. And because of that, it gets passed down from generation to generation. And so, grandparents swam, and so they ensure their children swim, or, parents swim, they then ensure their children swim. And then when that next generation has children, they too ensure they know how to swim and take them to get swim lessons. Precisely because swimming did not become broadly a part of African Americans' recreational culture during these two periods, it was not as commonly passed down from generation to generation to generation. And instead, not always, but much more commonly, what was passed down among African American families was a fear of water rather than sort of the habit and the cultural practice of swimming. And I think that sort of past discrimination thus casts a long shadow that continues to shape the swimming and drowning rates today. I probably talked on too long, and I maybe didn't get enough up to the present as I would have liked, but I'm happy to address and answer any questions that people might have.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's wonderful. I think one of the things that I would like to ask is that question that leads us into the present and maybe shifts the emphasis just a little bit from one kind of exclusion to what we face now, which is class-based or economic exclusion, as the waterfronts, which once were public, boat ramps, beaches, etc., are either explicitly privatized because they're in these gated communities or in these large private land holdings, or de facto privatized because it now costs $5 an hour to park at the beach, and there's only so many parking places.
Right.
So,
and in many cases, there's not public transportation to the public beaches. So you have to have a car, and you have to be able to afford the expensive parking there. Yeah. No, I mean, that's such an important point. In that, as I was alluding to before, the overt racial discrimination that severely restricted African Americans' access to swimming pools, swim lessons. Previously, we no longer have that sort of really overt, obvious racial discrimination. Instead, what we have is a significant class-based disparity in accessing swimming facilities. One of the things that I neglected, I sort of neglected to mention about one of the effects of racial desegregation is that I found many instances where when a pool that had been for whites only, when use of it transitioned to being sort of predominantly used by Black swimmers after desegregation, cities stopped funding sort of basic maintenance and upkeep on those pools. And I found many, many cases where after about 5, 6, or 7 years of the pool being used primarily by Black swimmers, all of a sudden in the city report. So I did a lot of research in public news, in newspapers. I also did a lot of research in annual reports. Kind of city departments would put out an annual report. And it was usually the Department of Parks and Recreations or the Department of Parks that would oversee the swimming pools. And I found many, many instances about 5, 6, 7 years after a pool had been being used primarily by Black swimmers, that all of a sudden now in the report, they're talking about closing down the pool because the cost of repairing the pool was too expensive. And the usage that was being used of the pool did not validate the expense of repairing it. In this, I mean, hopefully I'm not being too confusing what I'm talking about, but what oftentimes would happen is that when a pool was being used exclusively by whites, there was a much larger white population in the city, and so attendance statistics were very high. When African Americans started using the pool, there was a much smaller Black population in the city, and so whites would vacate it. It would be being used by Black Americans, but simply because the Black population was much smaller, the overall attendance had declined significantly. And then city officials would then use that declining attendance or the much lower attendance to then justify not spending the money to repair the pool. And so what I found were that there were many pools that Black Americans got access to, but their access to it was essentially temporary because within 5 to 10 years, many of those, not all, but many of those pools then ended up being closed down. And in a broader sense, what happens from the 1950s really through the 1990s, I think over the last couple of decades, things have started to change. And so maybe here's another story of a little bit of optimism. But from the 1950s through the 1990s, it's really a story of swimming pools becoming privatized. That the number of public pools in many cities actually declines. That cities close down pools and they don't replace them. They don't build new pools. Whereas during the same period, there are large numbers of private pools being built. And so the result of that is by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, it is relatively easy for someone who's middle class or above, middle or upper class, to be able to access pools and swim lessons because there's an abundance of private pools. Whereas for poor and working class Americans, they're literally having their, I don't know, so I say literally, they're having their access to pools increasingly restricted as public pools get shut down. And the consequence of that is Maya stated much more succinctly than I'm now stating, is that the reality today is that swimming disparities, and I also think we're going to increasingly see drowning disparities as well, but that there's a growing class-based swimming disparity between the poor and the working class of whatever racial identity, and the middle and the upper class of whatever racial identity as well. And studies are already starting to identify this class-based swimming disparity that I want to be hopeful that there is a recent trend of at least some cities and towns, and this tends to be more affluent ones, that there are sort of relatively affluent cities and towns that are building new public swimming pools. I live in Missoula, Montana, and it's a relatively affluent small city in Montana, and the city has built within the last 15 years a really nice public indoor facility, a very, very large public outdoor facility. And when I go to those pools, I mean, Missoula is not a particularly diverse place. It's overwhelmingly white, as is most of Missoula, but there is a significant Native American population, and there is a notable African-American population and Latino population. And the pool is a diverse place. There's a large outdoor pool, and it is a pool, a large 25-meter pool, along with, of course, the obligatory water park, which is what a lot of public funding goes to for water-based recreation. It's a very, very diverse place, and it's always crowded. And I know that there are bigger cities. Seattle is initiating a public pool building effort. I know Portland is looking into trying to increase its public pools. And so in relatively affluent places, I think there is room for optimism about public pools being built, and this providing access across racial and class lines. But I know in a lot of places in the country that are not sort of thriving economically, that money is not being invested in public pools, and this class-based disparity really remains pretty rigid.
Mm. Okay, I think we have a question. I see a Zoom hand raised.
Excellent.
Milan?
There, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Well, thank you, Jeff, so much for that. And thank you, Maya, also, and for Surfrider for making this possible. My head is just exploding right now. And thank you so much for your work, Jeff, and particularly the class-based conversation that we're having right now. You have transformed in the space of an hour a lot of my own awareness and my own history. I was a child in 1971 when we moved to one of those suburbs, a neighborhood, right, that had that pool built into it. It was part of the attraction, right? Was moving to that neighborhood with an Olympic-sized swimming pool. I'm thinking a lot about size, that you brought a big swimming pool, right? But you had to have a tag, a special tag that you wore that allowed you entrance, right, into that pool. I wanted to talk a little bit more, though, about private pool ownership, and I don't know if your work has looked much into that, or if there is much research. But what I'm thinking about also is how pools in white culture are aspirational, right? Like they are, like, it's not really, I don't even know if it's always that you want to learn to swim. I think you do as a kid. But I think from very early on, we imbibe, no pun intended, this idea, right, that you have made it as an American if you have a pool in your backyard.
Yeah.
And Maya knows, because I wrote about this a little bit recently. And so there is this narrative, I think, that that white folk inherit, right, that we inherit about the pool being what you're trying to reach, right? That's where you're trying to go. It is a class marker. It is aspirational. It is something you're trying to get to. And I would assume, because of what you've described in your conversation today and in your work, that narrative does not exist as intensely, right, in communities of color. And I'm wondering if that then means that if we looked at private pool ownership, and we understand that there's going to be economic disparity there, because there's economic disparity, period, in this country, and who can actually afford a pool, if there's any research into pool ownership even in communities of color and Black communities.
I mean, you've laid out I mean, that very well stated. So I did research and write about the growth in backyard pool ownership, which was accelerating rapidly, growing rapidly at precisely the historical moment that the suburban club pools were proliferating as well. And so they were largely a suburban phenomenon. And you're absolutely right that they were a status symbol. I mean, this was one of the things that was particularly appealing about them. They're also, I mean, what I argue in my book, and I'll sort of address your specific question in just a second. I mean, what I argue in my book is that in some ways they were a more extreme expression of the exclusivity of the suburban private club pool. That the suburban private club pool was exclusive along class and racial lines, that you could be assured at your suburban club pool that you would be swimming among people who looked like you and who were of a similar affluence as you were. But the backyard pool takes that a step further, in which you wanted to have even greater control over your social environment, over your recreational environment. And so I think that was another, there's sort of analysis that I applied to this of a sense of security. And so this was obviously during the Cold War. There was anxiety about sort of the nuclear threat. And so this idea of having a secure space, a private space for your family to recreate had sort of a psychological appeal. It had a social appeal to families. Now, addressing I've been avoiding your question in the answers. I don't know, and it's a great question. I certainly was not able to find, I wasn't looking for it, but now I'm kind of intrigued to try to look for it. I did not come across any statistics that broke down ownership of private backyard pools along racial lines. My assumption would be that it was overwhelmingly white families that built backyard pools, but maybe not. I mean, maybe that I would be surprised to find that in certain communities, in certain areas, among a more affluent sort of working class or middle class African American population, that there was a strong incentive to build a private backyard pool as a means to get access to swimming. I don't know the answer. It's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I really would like to know the answer to it.
Thank you. Margot's written some really interesting observations in the chat. And I don't know, would you like to ask Jeff a question directly, Margot? You'll have to unmute. There you go. Uh-oh, we still can't hear you.
Yeah, for some reason, I can't hear you, Margot.
No, we can't hear you. Well, she specifically talks about our situation here at our closest beach, which is called Wrightsville Beach. And there are no buses that go into the town of Wrightsville Beach from the city of Wilmington. So there is, right, as you alluded to, no public transportation. And in the last couple of years, parking rates have gone up to $5 an hour. And for most parking spaces, you can't use cash. You have to have a credit card and a smartphone with an app, a credit card or a smartphone with an app. And it's one of those, there are several fronts that we're a tiny little organization. We have really 10 committed active members and a lot of people who generally contribute to our efforts financially or with the occasional, come to an event. But we've been really trying to think about where to put our energy, and we've put a lot of it, both financial and human energy, into this initiative to sort of get kids from neighborhoods in the city who have not traditionally had access to the natural waterways to get them ready and out into it and encourage leadership development. And now we've got a plan for a jobs program over the next year or two where the kids who are turning 15 are going to move into lifeguard positions, hopefully eventually water safety instructor positions, so that they'll actually be leaders in the aquatic community. And this broader access issue, that seems much more overwhelming to me, like getting the town of Wrightsville Beach to let the buses come over the bridge.
Right.
That in and of itself, I don't know how we would ever do that other than just publicly shame them to the point where they, rolled over. But I don't know if you have any stories for us about, successes in the last 10 years for people who have taken on that kind of structural inhibition.
Yeah, I don't. So as a way of excusing myself for not having, means that my research is my research is now focusing on other things than swimming pools. I maybe should have just accepted being the swimming pool guy, but after my book came out and I published a couple of articles, I didn't want to be sort of just known within the history profession as the swimming pool guy. And so I've researched public music and some other things. And so I've not paid close enough attention to the last 10 years to know of success stories. I mean, unfortunately, what I know about are many other historical examples of what you've just described. There's a historian named Andrew Carl. You may be familiar with his work.
We had him give us a talk about his,
Yeah, and so
work.
Andrew has written a couple of books that, I mean, his first book really looked at the development of African-American beaches. His second book focused in on the shoreline in Connecticut and how, over a 20 to 30 year period of time, what had been, somewhat accessible somewhat accessible beachfronts in Connecticut had become overwhelmingly privatized. And what little strips were left as public beaches, there were the same sort of barriers that made it difficult for poor and working class people to get access to those beaches. And I the only thing I know is what Andrew has written, and it seems to me that at least in Connecticut, not much has changed. That it is still very hard for poor and working class people, say from Hartford, to be able to get access to the shoreline in Connecticut. And so unfortunately, I mean, what I know is just about the historical examples of those barriers being put into place rather than in more recent times, those barriers being deconstructed.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Jeff Wilste?
Maybe one I can answer.
I don't know.
I feel bad when I get questions that I don't know the answer to.
Sometimes it's comforting when even the experts don't know the answer to the things we've been looking for and haven't found. It actually is hard.
Sure.
Brad,
I'd like to shoot a question.
Please.
Hi, name's Brad.
Hi, Brad.
You speak to the economic situation and excuse me, I'd like to know if you looked into high class situations such as Dorothy Dandridge and, it being said that she put her foot into a pool in Las Vegas and thereafter they drained the whole pool. And she was a well-known singer and well above my economic status. Yes, could you speak upon that, or did you have any insight into higher class individuals who were still excluded from water despite their situation.
Yeah. I cannot off the top of my head sort of recall specific examples like that. That I've sort of researched and found myself. People have told me stories such as this. I've heard stories about like Black entertainers from the 1960s who were denied access to pools at like places they were performing at, were denied access to private clubs. I'm trying to remember one story, and I don't remember it very clearly, but I do recall sort of vaguely someone telling me a story, and again, this is second or third hand, of Sammy Davis Jr. With like Dean Martin and who's the most famous of them, the
Bing
Rat Pack?
Crosby,
No, not Bing Crosby. Old Blue Eye.
Frank Sinatra.
Frank Sinatra. Thank you.
We'll get there together.
That it was made clear that Sammy Davis Jr. was not welcome at a pool facility that they were wanting to hang out at. And so I don't have specific examples that I came across, but I have heard stories. But one thing I would say is there are a lot of stories of cities and towns draining their pools after the pools had been used by African Americans or Latino Americans. So in the Southwest, I've come across stories of cities and towns that, one day a week they would allow Latinos to use the pool, and then after that they would drain the water out of the pool and then refill it before whites would then use it. And similar stories in South Bend, Indiana. I gave a talk in South Bend, Indiana, and there were similar stories of the pool in South Bend, but this case that one day a week Black residents would be allowed to use the pool, but then the water would be drained, and some stories involve the scrubbing of the pool before it would be refilled. I've talked to people who manage and operate pools, and what they've told me is that to do that on a weekly basis would be very, very impractical. That it actually takes a long time to refill a full pool, and that they're skeptical that on a weekly basis the emptying and refilling of a pool would have occurred. What they claim is that much more realistically would have been, and I actually did find evidence of this in newspapers from the time, at the end of the season. So at the end of the swim season, people of color were allowed into the pool, and then after they were done using it for a couple of days, then it was drained for the season. And that seems realistic to me. And that also seemed realistic to the managers of pools who have had to empty pools and refill them. But they're somewhat skeptical of the on a weekly basis this happening. And so if that's true, and again, I don't know definitively, but if it's true that probably did not happen as often as some stories circulate about that, then the question becomes, sort of what would cause those stories to sort of generate in the first place, and then what would cause those stories to gain a wide currency. And my explanation on this is that what these stories help us understand, especially to the extent to which they get told within African American communities, is that these stories reveal something about how African Americans historically have understood their exclusion from pools. And that this is one of the ways in which they've made sense of their exclusion. And even though and again, maybe it did happen as often as the stories indicate, but even if it didn't happen as often as the stories indicate, it's a window into how historically African Americans have understood their exclusion from pool. That from sort of from their sense that they were I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. I want to be careful. That they were so marginalized by their exclusion from pools that the water had to be drained. That in the white community, that water that touched their skin was so contaminated that it had to be drained before, so that no whites would come into contact with that water. And again, even if it isn't as common literally as the stories would suggest, I think it tells us so much about how African Americans processed their exclusion from these pools and how they made sense of it. And so in that sense, I think the stories are extraordinarily valuable.
Really interesting. Okay, we're a little over time, and I just want to, first of all, thank you so much for this. This is, I've got I can tell the Surfrider executive board are gushing all over you in my text. It's just the phone is
I appreciate
vibrate off the box. And everybody's very excited about knowing this, having this on board, this history, which we would not have if you had not taken what I know must have been excruciating efforts to get this story together and in published form for us to read. So thank you so much for your work. And one thing that we didn't really touch on that I just want to say to everyone, thank you for coming. And part of the story that is a subtext and then at the end explicit in this book is the retreat from public life in the US since the middle of the 20th century. And I have noticed that even people who love swimming and love surfing and love the idea of helping kids with swim lessons, it's very hard to get people out of their own existential private pools. I mean, it's like we've all focused so much on our own backyards that it is really difficult to get people engaged in the community in a way that isn't just a one-off, but that really is putting life energy and taking life energy from these more communal, open fora and spaces and just places that we can be in big groups. I don't think I've been, any place with thousands of my neighbors that was public ever really in my life. I mean, maybe the beach, on July 4th or something like that. So I would, I ask all of you to join me in this sort of thinking about how, as we participate in these conversations, and as some of you come and help with swim lessons, how we can just sort of share the joy, because that really, it is so it's not just inspiring in the way that we usually use that word, but in the way that it is etymologically significant. You really breathe in all kinds of life force from these public engagements and the intergenerational and the intergendered and the interracial and all these things that are now available to us. When we don't live in an era of explicit legal segregation, we seem to be self-segregating to our own detriment. And so please help me figure out how we can all get in the water together safely and joyfully. And thank you so much, Dr. Wilste, for your work.
Oh, thank you. And well said there at the end. I could not agree more. And unfortunately, COVID both sort of reinforced the trends you're talking about, but I think also COVID made the opposite, which is sort of the sense of community and public engagement, all the more important. And so it sort of pushed us further down that road, but at the same time made the counter trend that you're advocating even more important.
Great. Okay. Really important to hear that this, I think you're right, that these things are becoming more and not less important.
Yeah.
And COVID pushed us in the wrong direction. And we have obviously all sorts of political divisions and things that are also pushing us away from each other. and encouraging us to be afraid. I put my email in the chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and sign us off here because I bet Dr. Wilste has other things to do with his evening. But please be in touch with me and, join Surfrider. Please join our efforts. The NC Swim Foundation is at the Earl Jackson Pool down on Best Street, right across from the police station downtown. And they can always use help of all sorts, clerical, administrative, swimming lessons. And Voyage of Wilmington wants people in Wilmington who are in a position to do so to help with their jobs program, to hire the teenagers. They pay the salary. Voyage pays the salary. All you need to do is provide the job, the supervision, and the mentoring so that these kids can get job experience. So thank you, Dr. Wilste. Thank you, all of you. And I hope that we see you on future talks and at Surfrider meetings. And Jeff, come to Wilmington. We'll surf. We'll teach you how to surf even more.
I will. I may very well take you up on that offer.
Please do. We would love to have you. Good night,
well, thank you.
everybody.
Thank you all for listening to me go on. I appreciate it.
Please keep going on.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.